Hello. Today we're going to talk about managing international operations. Basically, we're going to go over a range of challenges related to operations management. Challenges that are particularly likely to occur in the international context. And I'll give you a number of examples and we'll discuss the options or possible solutions to those challenges. And so we're going to start with the challenges of capacity planning. As you understand, one of the big challenges that you will have is to estimate how many units of product you have to make. If you make too many, you may risk not selling them, and in that case, you'll just have a bunch of stuff in your warehouse that you cannot sell and that you invested money in, and then you lose profits, right? You lose money. On the other hand, if you underplan, if you do not produce enough, then you potentially can lose some lucrative profits because people would have bought more if you had more and you didn't plan carefully, so you don't have enough, so you may lose. So how do you know how much to produce? And I'm not going to get into all those mathematical models of capacity planning. I'm just going to talk about some of the interesting special cases that you will have to deal with in the international context. Meaning that you may have a wonderful mathematical economic model for your capacity planning for your domestic market. It may work very well. It may be very successful, very accurate. But if you go international, there are some factors that may completely mess up your calculations. And those are some of the factors here. For example, I'm going to give you an example from a colleague of mine, a friend of mine from a few years ago. So, it was Dr. Alan Ponick, and it just happened to be so that he had a couple of brothers, and so he himself was a professor of labor relations, and if I remember correctly, one of the brothers was some sort of a religious leader, and the other brother, the third one, was a banker. And as I understand, he was not a top manager of a bank, but he was somewhere in the management, kind of middle, perhaps upper level manager. And so while Alan was in Canada at the time when I met him, his brother, the banker one, he was working in France, and I believe it was actually in Paris. And so the story is the following. So that bank that my friend's brother worked for got acquired by another bank. And so the new bank, after that merger or acquisition, decided that they don't need so many people anymore. And so they decided to lay off some people. In the United States, for example, or even in Canada, especially if there is no union, laying off people is usually very easy. I mean, as long as there is economic need to lay off people, you can do that. You just lay them off, and that's it. If there is a collective bargaining agreement in place, if there is a union, it may be more difficult, but generally, in North America, it's no problem. So if you plan for certain capacity and you hire people and you lay them off, and at some point it looks like you don't need all those people because your capacity is, you don't need as much as you thought you would, you just lay off some people. Well, in Europe, turns out it's a very different story, especially in France. It's much, much harder to get rid of people. So in that particular case, the brother of my colleague was laid off, but because of the laws that regulate this sort of stuff, he was entitled to 1 year salary or a severance package equivalent to 1 year compensation. And I don't know all the nuances. Was it because he worked for so long for the company? Was it because of his level? Probably a combination of those all. But the point is that in order to lay him off, in order to let him go, the organization had to pay him for 1 entire year of work. Now, luckily for him, he was able to find a new job in a couple of weeks, so he basically just got some free money and that's it. But the point here is that while in some countries like the United States, you as an employer can be very, I don't want to call it careless, but you don't have to worry too much about hiring too many people, because once you hire them, if something goes wrong, you can always lay them off. But in some other countries, especially in more socialist European countries, it may not be so easy. So you have to be super careful. You hire too few, you lose profits. You hire too many, you may be stuck with them. You may not have an easy way out. It may be very difficult to get rid of those people. Now, there are also some other things that may, affect your decisions as to where you hire people and how you hire people. Again, I'm just going to give you a few specific examples. For example, if you look at the map of the United States and Canada, you will see that in one point, on the Canadian side, it would be the province of Ontario. On the American side, it would be the province of Michigan. The state of the Michigan state. And so on the American side, the city would be called Detroit, right? That's where they make all those cars and all that, car-related stuff. On the Canadian side, the city is called Windsor, and it's a different city technically, but on the map they almost, look together. And so they are separated by a body of water, but you can, on a good day, you can probably see, the other city across the water. Now, many American companies from Detroit choose to build their factories in Canada. So, for example, all those automotive companies that make cars, as well as many companies that make parts for those cars, many of them choose to open their production in Canada. Why would that be the case? Well, many people think, that's because Canada has lower wages. And that is not true. On average, Canadian income may be somewhat lower than American income. But if you look at the wages, especially in the kind of low skill segment, or kind of not the super rich part, in Canada, they likely will be a little higher. In fact, the minimum wage tends to be higher in Canada, and the median wage tends to be higher in Canada. The average tends to be higher in the United States because America has more millionaires, people like Bill Gates and, like people who make a lot of money, and so they pull the average up. But if you look at the median, and if you don't know the difference, look it up on the internet, Canadians actually, an average Canadian, especially a factory worker, actually often tends to make a little bit more than an American worker. And the difference is minuscule, not a huge one, but it's not the wage. It's not because Ontarians make less than Michiganians, I guess. So that's the reason why American companies go to Canada. One of the reasons, and in many cases could be the reason, is that having an employee may cost you less in Canada than in the United States. And here is how it works. In Canada, the healthcare system is public, and in the United States, it's private, it's insurance companies. And so you as an employer would be required in would be required in the United States in most cases to provide health insurance to your employees. And that is a lot of money. For example, when I look at my health insurance, 100% of it is covered by my employer for me personally, and 50% of my family insurance is also covered by the employer. My portion is still huge. It's about $430 per month that I still have to pay effectively as a tax for my health insurance. Now, the rest is paid by the university, which is a total of about $15,000 a year when you see how much they actually pay. Technically, that's the money that could have been added to my salary. So that's technically the money that I could have been getting as my salary, but now the employer has to pay that money for my insurance, and therefore this money is kind of lost. So if it was not for that money, my employer could have offered me $15,000 less, and I would still be equally wealthy if I didn't have to pay for the health insurance. Now in Canada, depending on the province, the taxes, corporate taxes, may be slightly higher, slightly lower, depending on what state and what province you compare. But overall, it's actually not that different. In fact, corporate profit tax, income tax, is a little lower in Canada than it is in the United States. On top of that, Canadians, all those taxes already include, or the taxes the Canadians pay already include the healthcare tax. So the employees don't have to pay anything for the healthcare. It's free, so there is no health insurance. Well, it's not really free, it's included in taxes, but as I said, it doesn't really make Canadian taxes much higher, or noticeably higher. So which means for the same dollars, an employer in Canada can actually buy more employees than a same employer could buy in the United States. And so that makes good sense. On top of that, not only it is cheaper because you don't have to pay for the health insurance, on top of that, Canadians actually tend to be healthier. Because of their different healthcare system, it actually works better, it costs less, but also it works better. So Canadians get sick less, they have fewer days when they have to be absent because of illness, they actually live longer as well. So as a result, as an employer, you can actually afford more employees and suffer lower losses due to absenteeism in Canada, even though the actual wages would be roughly the same. So the operating cost to you as an employer would actually be lower in Canada. And so that in many cases prompts American employers to go to Canada and hire people there. Again, there are other factors at play, but those are some of them. And those are important things, and sometimes, as I said, more important than the wages themselves. Also talking about capacity planning and operating cost. In Africa, as you know, there are all kinds of, kind of peculiar diseases, and one of them is malaria. That's the disease that the mosquitoes, carry around, and when they bite you, sting you, right, the virus may get into your body. Turns out it's a huge problem in Africa. In some regions, the rate of people getting sick with malaria is huge, and it's a very heavy disease, so when people get sick, they miss work. And so in some regions, some companies see absenteeism rate of about 40% due to that illness. Imagine that you plan to, make whatever you want to make, and you hire, let's say you calculate and you decide that you need to hire 1,000 people. You hire 1,000 people, boom, only 600 of them show up at work because the rest of them are sick. It's a huge problem. And so as a result, you still have to pay those people, keep them on the payroll, but almost half of them are away every single day. And so as I understand, it's not like that in every single region, and probably not even all year round, but in some regions that is the case. And so Western companies, when they go to Africa, they have to account for that sort of problem. Some companies, by the way, try to do something about it, and there was a conference a few years ago, the Academy of Management, that I'm a member of and that I went to. And the theme of the conference was doing well by doing good. So how can you do well, make money by doing good, by doing things that are not necessarily profit related? And so there was a man there from, I believe it was Monsanto, and they have some factories in that region. And he said, well, we saw, he was one of the top managers, CEO, I believe, of the company. And he said, well, we had this huge problem. So we hire people and half of them don't show up to work. And so we thought, well, maybe we should spend the money and spray the whole, area around the factory with some kind of mosquito repellent, so that fewer mosquitoes come and bite people, and fewer people get sick, and so absenteeism rate is not that low. And so while that is good for the people, they kind of had the business agenda in mind. And so they did, but the problem is that the wind blows, and even if you spray the whole town, in a few hours, the wind will carry new mosquitoes into the town. And so eventually they sprayed the whole county, like the whole big area around the town, and that didn't help. And then eventually they had some sort of a partnership with a number of companies and governments or municipal authorities in that area. And together they literally would spray like half of the entire country. And that, while it cost a lot of money, it substantially reduced the occurrence of malaria, and as a result improved participation, so reduced absenteeism, and as a result made good economic sense. So again, in Europe, in North America, you wouldn't be thinking about those problems. But in Africa, all of a sudden, that is the issue. Likewise, when you choose a location, so how do you choose where you want to start your business? Again, many people think, well, maybe let's look at wages. There is much more to choosing the location than just the wages. So you have to look at, obviously, wages, but then also skills. If your job requires, special skills, and people where you want to open the business may be very cheap but don't have those skills, it wouldn't work. Transportation cost, right? Proximity to suppliers, customers, resources. I mean, again, you don't want to move either resources too much or products too much, or, if your customers are too far. Proximity to ports, airports, highways, and other infrastructure. Again, could be a very important thing, especially if you have some sort of a high-tech company. Taxes, tax breaks, import tariffs, credit availability, labor capital intensity, and we'll talk about that later. Risk of currency fluctuations, public relations, all those are very, very important factors that you should consider. So let's talk about them one by one, but first let me give you another example. For example, most of the Japanese cars like Toyota or Honda, most of them would be made actually in the United States if they are sold in the United States. So for example, I have a Honda Odyssey. It's like a minivan family car. And so mine was made in Oklahoma. So it's a Japanese brand, but it was made in the United States. And then the question becomes, why do all those Toyotas and Hondas make their cars in the United States and not in Japan? Well, there are a number of reasons. Well, first of all, it's definitely not wages. Wages in the United States are higher than they are in Japan. It's definitely not other, obvious factors such as maybe, taxes. Well, taxes are actually lower in the United States, but not by a huge margin. So again, probably not necessarily the case. Probably not even skills. I mean, Japanese are extremely skilled people, so probably not the reason. But there could be also all kinds of other reasons, like, for example, proximity to the consumers. Why would you want to make your cars in Japan and then transport them literally across the planet when you can make them right in the United States for American consumers? And again, if you travel around, you probably saw that American version of Japanese cars is very different from what they sell in Japan or even in Europe, right? I don't think they sell Honda Odyssey anywhere outside North America. I mean, that car would be just too big for any other, market. Then on top of that, in many cases, they would get all kinds of concessions from the local governments. For example, when a Honda or Toyota factory is to be opened, they kind of play this game. They would say, well, we want to open a factory and we're going to hire, let's say, 5,000 people. And where should we open it? Yeah, we know it's going to be in the United States, but we're not sure about the state. And they wait. And then the states start bidding and they say, oh, open it in North Carolina. If you open it in North Carolina, we're going to give you a 5-year tax holiday. And then Oklahoma says, oh, no, open in Oklahoma. If you open in Oklahoma, we're going to give you 10 years tax holiday. And on top of that, we're going to build a road to your factory for free. And then California says, no, do it in California. We'll give you 10 years tax holiday. We'll build the road. And we will even give you a grant of $2 million so you can, start your business. And then eventually they would get the best bid and build the factory there. And so again, if you do it in your domestic market, in many cases you wouldn't get those concessions. So all those things matter and all those things play a huge role. And when you take them into account, what first looked like a good location may not look like a good location anymore. All right, so here is a question to make sure that you've been paying attention. And the correct answer is E. So C and D both are correct answers. Now, if you're watching this online, and obviously you are, there is a very interesting short video about 10 minutes about Body Glove. That's the company that makes wetsuits and other stuff for surfing, but also all kinds of other products. And the reason I want you to watch it now is because it talks a lot about the challenges that Body Glove had with respect to capacity planning, with respect to operations management when they decided to go global, and so they explained their choices. And the video is a little old, so it's a few years old, but all those decisions, all those ideas apply. Plus, again, if you like active sports, especially surfing, you probably will find it very interesting just to watch. So I'm going to move on here, but I trust that you pause here and watch that other video that is available to you if you are taking my class for credit. If not, we're going to be talking about those things together. And I don't think it's available online. I'm sure it's copyrighted, so I don't think you can just find it online and watch it online. Now, one of the challenges that Body Glove discusses in the video is that of outsourcing. And so they talk there about the fact that first they were trying to make their products themselves. Apron, whatever the name of I think that's the name of the material. But anyway, the kind of rubbery material that they used to make the wetsuits. And so they were making them in the United States, literally, sewing them here. And then they explored options in Asia, and they found that in some Asian countries they can get equal or even better quality for a fraction of the cost. And so they eventually decided to outsource production and focus on the brand management, basically, promotion, marketing, all that kind of stuff. Now, the problem is that when we talk about outsourcing, many people not always know what that is. So we understand that outsourcing, that's when you outsource, when you buy from another company something that you need to, make a business happen. But there is a very fine line between buying and outsourcing. So for example, let's say we're talking about General Motors, a company that makes cars. So when they buy, let's say, chairs for their employees, like the one that I have, and not make them in-house, would that be outsourcing? Well, probably not, because making chairs is not a core capability. So they make cars. This is just materials that they buy to make it happen. What if they buy, let's say, engine oil for its fleet of corporate cars? So the car that, for example, the manager drives. If they buy oil for that car from somebody else, is that outsourcing? Well, probably not. Well, what about oil that they buy for the cars that they sell? So as you understand, when the car rolls out of the assembly line, it has some oil in the engine, right? So when they do that, is that outsourcing? Well, here it's kind of tricky because, they make the car, but this particular component is made by somebody else. What about paint that they use to paint the cars? Again, paint becomes part of the car. Making cars is their core capability, core competency, right? They buy that component of the car from somebody else. Does that become outsourcing? Probably so. How about motors? How about electrical motors? How about tires? How about windshields? Wires? So when they buy all those components, is it outsourcing or is it just buying components? That's where it becomes a little tricky. And some companies literally outsource a good portion of their work, and it's not always easy to determine, is it outsourcing or is it just buying components to make products? Now, why would you want to make stuff in-house, or why would you want to outsource things and basically let somebody else make them? Well, reasons to make, obviously, sometimes it may be cheaper. I mean, people, when they make stuff for you, they want to make profit. So you could have that profit if you can make it equally cheaply and equally well, right? You often have greater control over quality when you make it in-house. Again, a big deal. I believe I already used the example of Dyson, and if I didn't, I will use in one of the lectures. Those are those very expensive vacuum cleaners. And so the problem with them is not only that they are bagless, which was a problem when Dyson wanted to sell a license, but also when he wanted to outsource production and focus on the brand brand management. He found that there were not many companies that could meet his quality standards. So by keeping it in-house, it may cost more to make and it may be more cumbersome, but it gives you the control over quality, and you can get the best quality there is for your product. Now, very important, by not outsourcing your production, you can also keep the know-how, the technology, because if you need to outsource something, you need to teach your basically outsourcee, so whoever makes that product for you, how to make the product. And so if you have some super special technology, you don't want to outsource it because, you will have to teach them how to make it. And once they know they don't need you, they may sell that product on their own, right? Plus, again, you have a little bit more control over the location, a little bit more control over the process. Now, why would you want to outsource? Well, there are many, many reasons. In fact, I just read a very interesting book called The Future of Business is Small Business. I believe that was the title. And so the story there, or the main message there, is that today it's become so easy to outsource. It's so easy to find partners to whom you could outsource your production, that soon enough there will be no company left that is large and makes everything in-house. Everything and anything that is made will basically be made by a collection of small companies that work together but are more or less a client and outsourcee type of relationship. So just about everything and anything, smallest components, will be made always by somebody else. And so the end producer, whose brand logo will be on the product, will be the company that just makes it all put together. So anyway, when you outsource, you have much greater flexibility. Something goes wrong, you want to change something, you just change the supplier, right? You have much lower risk. I mean, imagine if, let's say, General Motors or Mercedes-Benz, imagine if they had to make their own tires, right? The wheels for the cars. That's tough to make it. I mean, it's a huge, difficult process. I mean, it's not like you can just start making rubber tires. So it's much easier to outsource it to somebody who does, Michelin, Bridgestone, whoever makes tires. So it gives you more flexibility, and again, it gives you less risk, because if you invested all that money up front, if something doesn't work, you would lose it. And so here, big deal, it doesn't work from this one, you just choose another supplier. It may also be a lower cost. I mean, yes, it seems like it would be cheaper to do it yourself, but again, if you outsource it to a company that makes those things on a large scale, their scale is much larger than your scale. Like, for example, let's say you decided to make cell phones, right? Like this one here. And so you need to buy for this one or make for this cell phone a battery, right? You don't want to develop your own battery, because how many cell phones will you sell? You don't know, probably not that many. On top of that, it will be very costly to develop the production of the battery process, right? And you don't want that. So you just go to a company that makes batteries. They make millions of them because they sell them probably to all manufacturers like Motorola, Nokia, and whoever else makes phones today. And so it's cheaper to buy from them because they have larger volume. They have lower marginal cost. It costs them less to make next unit of the battery. Plus, the most important, you don't need to deal with, investment in research, development, management. You can focus on the things that you really know and that you really enjoy, and let everybody else deal with that. Today, increasingly, companies also outsource accounting services. So instead of having an accountant on payroll, you just outsource and hire an accountant who works for you part-time. In fact, it could be a company and you don't even know the specific individual. And if it's a small company, it can cost you much less than to keep an accountant, on your payroll full-time. Secretarial services are often outsourced. IT support is often outsourced. So just about anything related to your business, you can these days outsource relatively easily. Now, other considerations. When you outsource, sometimes things can go not necessarily wrong. They can go different to what they were expected to go. I'll give you a few examples. For example, when you outsource, so first as someone who buys stuff, so someone who places the order, for you may become dependent on somebody else. For example, I don't know, you decided to buy a certain product, and so you decided not to develop it in-house, but instead hire someone who will do it for you. I'll use a very simple example, like for example, for my projects, some of the data management tasks that I need done, I outsource them. I have people whom I pay and they put it all together and manage it all. The problem is that over time I lose that capability, so it's developed so far that I no longer know how to do it myself. And if something goes wrong, if that person gets sick, who helps me? Or if they decide to charge more, I don't really have many choices. I have to stick with them. And so had I from the very beginning been doing it in my, in-house myself, I would be a little more independent and perhaps more flexible with some things. On the other hand, when you are the supplier, so when you accept from somebody an order and so they outsource the work to you, it's a wonderful idea, it's great, you work with them, but over time you may become too dependent on them. For example, here's a story of Vlasic. Vlasic, it's a North American company, that makes all kinds of stuff related to cucumbers. And it used to be a small, proud company, that would make pickles and some other types of, cucumber-based products. And then at some point, some years ago, Walmart, the largest in the world retailer, approached them and said, well, we want to buy your pickled cucumbers. And so they had a deal, and when Walmart approaches you, normally they order a huge volume. I mean, they have so many stores all around the world. They sell huge volumes. And so if you get a contract with Walmart, you are guaranteed to make some money because it's so huge. But Walmart knows that you want to get their contract, and so they will ask for a very thin profit margin, because they say, well, look, you will sell so many of those products that you can probably survive on a very thin profit margin. And that's what happened to Vlasic. In fact, they started with a $3, I believe, gallon of pickles. So you basically could buy a 1 month supply of pickles for like $3, which at that time it was almost like 1/10 of the normal price. Now, even though the price was so low, Vlasic was still very happy to get the contract because of the volume, they were still making a lot of money, millions of dollars in profits. Now, over time, Walmart became a more important buyer for Vlasic, and soon enough, they found themselves in a situation where about 95% of all the product that they made, all the cucumbers that they made, was sold through Walmart. Now, Walmart knew that Vlasic depends on them for that retailers, because if Walmart canceled the contracts, Vlasic would lose 95% of their volume. And Vlasic, I mean, again, we're talking about huge production. I mean, they literally would have like fields that, as far as the eye can see, you can drive for hours and you would see those cucumbers, grown by Vlasic. So, but Vlasic was so dependent on Walmart that eventually Walmart was able to squeeze virtually a no profit production out of Vlasic. So they were making only about 0.2% on the volume that they were selling through Walmart. So for every $1 worth of cucumbers they sold, they were making only 0.2%. So it's not even 1 cent. It's like it's nothing. It's like 0.2 cents out of every $1. And they couldn't say anything or do anything about that, because if they did, if Walmart, if it didn't work out with Walmart, they would have to lose basically all their capacity. So at some point it becomes kind of addictive and you may not be able to get out, and as a result it may be very difficult for you to stay in the business, or you will become more or less somebody's slave, or servant for no pay. All right, capacity planning forgotten, or discussed and hopefully remembered. Now let's talk about something else. Another big challenge that you will have when you go international is that nobody will know you in a new market. So for example, you make products, whatever those products are. Let's say, for example, chips for these computers, for these cell phones. So here in Greensboro in North Carolina, we have 2 companies that make a number of components for cell phones, including chips, but also some sort of modulators for the antenna. And so if you have, for example, a Samsung phone or Apple phone, there are components in your phone made by a factory here in Greensboro, right? Now, let's say in North Carolina or in the United States in general, those companies are known and everybody knows that if you buy components from these guys, they will be of high quality, they will work well. Now imagine that you decided to go and sell your products, for example, processors in Europe. Well, nobody knows you in Europe. How can you prove that you have a good product? Well, there is something called ISO 9000. ISO is International Standards Organization, It's an international organization that basically certifies products for their quality, and they do much more than that, but that's the main point. And so what you can do is you can apply for the ISO 9000 certification, which is basically a stamp of approval, a stamp of quality. And if you get that, what you can do now, you can go to any market and you can say, well, I'm making these processors or batteries or screens, and they are ISO 9000 certified. And then the buyer may not know you, but once they see that it's certified by ISO, they know it's good quality. So they probably will be much happier buying your product than somebody else's product. Now, in reality, ISO does much more. And so it's not only that they, look at the quality and say it's good enough. They actually will review your entire production process. They will give you advice on how to improve your production quality and production process. So it's a much more comprehensive approach. And so if you have that certificate, that means that you are basically good at all levels. And that will allow you to present yourself in a much more favorable light when you go to new markets where nobody knows you. Because once you have ISO 9000 certification, you're a king, right? Now, here is a question about that. And the answer is E. All of these are correct about ISO 9000. Now, another big issue that you will have to deal with is financing. First, a little bit about where the money can come from. You have several different options for raising capital to expand your business, especially when you go international. And you can simply borrow money, you can issue equity, or you can use internal funding. And let's talk about them. So the first two are really the main types. For business, there are two main types to get money. One is a loan. So you borrow money. You come to the bank, you say, look, I'm trying to expand my production. I want to do business internationally. I need $1 million for that. And they say, well, here is $1 million, but we want that $1 million back in, let's say, 10 years plus interest, let's say plus 5 or 10% interest. So which means that you will give them the money they gave you back plus whatever interest will be on top of that money. And so if it's a 10-year loan on $1 million, 5%, it will probably add, $200,000 or something like that. So it's going to be more than, because if it was only 1 year and the interest rate was 5%, it would have been $50,000, right? But because it's 10 years, you basically pay that over time. Now, so that's where you borrow money and you give money back plus interest. Equity, that's when you sell a portion of your company. You say, I need $1 million to expand my business, and the bank says, usually an investment bank, or sometimes a venture capitalist or angel investor. We're not going to get into the details how those are different. They say, all right, here is $1 million, but now I'm going to own half of your company. So half of all the profits that you make will go to me. And when I decide to sell my half of the company, whatever I make at that time, that will be my profit. And so in some cases, when your company does well, when your profits are high, they may get a lot more than what they invested. And if the stock prices will go up, they may sell their share for much more than they invested. Or if the company doesn't do well, they may lose everything. So that's a risk. So they normally know that they will lose 9 out of 10 investments, but 1 in 10 will become so profitable that it will make those 9 losses worth it. And finally, internal funding, that's where you can ask for money more or less from your own company or from a partner company. But that's, a special case. It's like borrowing from the relatives. Now, difficulties with borrowing when you go international. It's difficult to get money for your business when you are in one country, but it's much, much more difficult when you have to do it internationally. And here is the problem. When you want to borrow money domestically, you come to a bank, they look at your credit score. If it's good, they know that you are a reliable person, and they know if they give you the money, you probably will pay it back because all the previous times you paid it back. Plus, they know if you for some reason will not be able to pay the money back, they can come for you, they can seize your property, they can seize your company, land, buildings, whatever you have, equipment, sell it and recoup some of their expenses that way. So there will be some sort of a collateral and there will be a way to get it back. And so for the domestic bank, for the one in your country, the risks are fairly low, right? Especially when they can review your credit history and there is some collateral, stuff that you can put against the credit. Now, when you go international, all of a sudden you put yourself in a very tricky situation. Here, on the one hand, the bank here in your own country will not be willing to give you the money because they say, well, I trust you, I would be happy to give you the money, but you're gonna spend it overseas, you wanna open a factory somewhere else. And there is no guarantee for me that I will be able to get your property if you stop paying the money. Plus, I don't know much about that foreign market. I don't know if it's worthwhile, if it's going to bring you profits so you can pay back. No, I'm not going to give you the money. If you were opening the business here, I would be comfortable. But when you're over there, it's not like you will have as much control as you normally do, and we will not be able to come after you. Now you go to that country, let's say, for example, China, and you come to a Chinese bank and you say, well, guys, would you give me the money? And they say, well, we don't know you. I mean, yes, the business will be here, but we don't know your credit history. We don't even have that thing in place, credit history. So no, we're not going to give you the money. If you were a local guy, with a history and with connections and, we would know something about you, then sure, yes. But now, I mean, we don't know who you are. Maybe you'll just take the money and run. So we're not gonna give you that money. And so that's the problem. I was in that same situation. Here is, by the way, a picture of me defending my dissertation in 2008, right? So I had that problem when I was moving between the countries, the United States and Canada. My first few moves, I was in a situation where, for example, I spent 2 years in Texas doing my master's degree in Dallas, and then I went to Canada. Now, I had a very strong credit history in the United States, in Texas, and I had no problems with, credit cards. And, if I needed to borrow money, I would easily be able to get a loan. Now, I come to Canada, I apply for a credit card, and they say, no, we cannot give you a credit card. I'm like, what do you mean you cannot give me a credit card? I have already a few from the United States. And they say, well, we do not recognize American credit history, and you don't have any credit history in Canada, so we don't know who you are, so we're not going to give you any credit cards. And so eventually what they did is they issued me one of those prepaid credit cards where I have to, a limit like $1,000 a month or something like that, and I had to keep $1,000 at all times in my account, so that basically they always have access to the money that I put on my credit card. And then after some time, like a year or so, when my credit history was established in Canada, at that point they finally gave me a regular credit card. And so eventually I had a good credit score in Canada as well, and so could show up at a bank and ask for money in either country if I needed to. Now, sometimes what companies do is a so-called back-to-back loan. So that's like one of those prepaid credit cards. It's kind of more complicated. You don't really need to know all the details. But the idea here is that if, let's say, for example, an American company decides to open a business in Mexico, they may not be able to get money from an American bank because the money will be spent in Mexico and the American bank will not be comfortable with that. They may not be able to get money from a Mexican bank because it's a new company, they don't have the credit history, they don't know who those guys are. So in some cases they would have like a security deposit or security account in many cases the American bank, and they would put, the parent company would put some money there, and the Mexican bank will be shown that money and will be given access to that account. And so they would still loan the money, but they would always kind of see that American account with the same amount of money. So if the client stops paying in Mexico, the Mexican bank can get that money from the American bank. And so in a sense, it's like back to back. So it's like almost like the prepaid credit card. Again, helps a lot, especially in the early stages while you are still trying to build up your business history, business credibility in the new market. Issuing equity, so selling basically part of your company. Again, normally not a huge deal if you do it domestically. You issue some shares, you list them on a local stock exchange, and you sell it. And it's a little more complicated. Going IPO is a little more complicated than that, but it's doable. It's not a huge deal. If you decide to do it internationally, that's where all of a sudden it becomes a problem, because again, there are always some kind of, or often some kinds of regulations where you can or cannot sell shares of foreign companies in the market. So, for example, you want to sell your shares in the country where you are. For example, let's say you are in Ukraine, and you want to sell shares of your company that you're trying to open, let's say in Turkey. And there may be regulations that say that no, you cannot sell shares of companies that are actually operating overseas. Vice versa, you may not be able to sell shares of your company in that market, let's say in Turkey, because it's technically a Ukrainian company. And again, there may be all kinds of restrictions. On top of that, going IPO in a foreign market may be very complicated, and there may be all kinds of other barriers and problems that you may not be able to manage. And so there are a number of options that may be available to you. Again, you probably will forget all these names and all those little things, but remember that these options are available. And so when the time for you comes to sell shares of your companies in a new market, remember that there is an option. Talk to your bank, they will tell you all that stuff. But for example, what you would do is there is something called American Depositary Receipts, and you actually also have them in most other countries. Plus, you will, as we'll discuss in a minute, you also have global depository receipts that kind of work the same way. And the way it works is this. Imagine that you want to sell a product, shares of your company in a foreign market. Let's say, for example, in the United States, right? But your company is not an American company. So for you, it's impossible to list it on a stock exchange in the United States, or at least it's not very easy. What you can do is you can issue pieces of paper that say something like this. They literally will look kind of bigger like this, which says each of these pieces of paper represents, let's say, 0.1% of your company. So if you buy 100 of them, you will own 1% of my company with all the dividends and profit sharing, whatever else goes into it. Now, you cannot sell these things in the United States on let's say, New York Stock Exchange, but what you can do is you can come to an American bank and you can say, well, I'll give you these pieces of paper. It's a foreign company, and you will own it. And can you please issue now pieces of paper by an American company, by an American bank that will represent these my own pieces of paper? And the bank will say, sure, we can do that. And so the bank will now issue an American kind of share, or as they call depository receipt, and they will say each of these pieces of paper represents each of these pieces of paper, or one of these represents one of these. And so now this is an American issued document that represents a share in your company, or whatever other financial instruments you want to sell. And so by doing so, you go through the bank and you kind of become local in a sense. The bank obviously will charge you for that, so there will be some percentage that you will lose, but it still may be much easier than opening a whole company in the market of interest and issuing local shares. So through the bank, you kind of can do that, and you can start selling your shares of your company right away through the local institutions. So, and there are a few examples here how some companies can do that. And so there is also something called global depository receipts. So while American depository receipts, or whatever other companies have that kind of system, are specifically designed to be sold in America, or again, whatever country we're talking about, global depository receipts kind of create or do the same thing for the whole market. And so, for the whole globe. And so global depository receipts are normally traded in London and Luxembourg. And so when you go with one of those brokers or banks that work with those stock exchanges, you can literally start selling your shares all around the world through those banks. And so they will issue pieces of paper that represent shares of your company, and that will allow you to go global with a relatively small hassle. Again, it may be not easy to work it out with the bank, but as long as you do, you may skip a few hurdles. Now, here is a question for you. And the answer is D. Finally, venture capital. You can go to venture capitalists. Those are the people who want to invest in usually startups with the hopes that the company will do well and the value of the company will go up. And so at some point, usually a few years later, they will be able to sell their share for a profit. So for example, if you want to make, as we said, cell phones and you need $1 million, you can get a loan from a bank or you can sell shares on a stock exchange, but you can come to investors, venture capitalists, and they will give you the money and they will own part of your company. And then at some point they may, well, obviously they will share the profits, but at some time they may also want to sell their shares, usually like in 3-4 years. And if the company is successful, like for example, Facebook, right? If you invested in Facebook at a good time, your share may become worth 100 times just a few years later, right? So as you probably have heard about Facebook controversy, there was apparently at some point when Facebook was nothing but Mark Zuckerberg in his dorm room writing the code, or shortly after that. So apparently he wanted to start the company and he needed some money, and there was some kind of guy who claims that he gave him, I believe it was $10,000. Not a huge amount of money, but at that time $10,000 mattered a lot to Zuckerberg. And apparently, or allegedly, Zuckerberg said that for these $10,000 you own half of my company. Because again, at that time he didn't know it will become a big thing, so it seems like a good deal. So you get money for free, and you know, if it works you'll give just half of it, but if it doesn't, you don't owe anything to anyone. And then a few years later, as you know, Facebook is a multi-billion-dollar company. So the $10,000 turned into many $billion. So it's what, like they went IPO, I believe it was like 40 billion valuation. So like huge, many billions of dollars. All of a sudden, if that is true, the man who allegedly gave $10,000 representing half of the company, by now technically owns half of Facebook. Many $billion. Well, eventually it didn't work out, and I believe there was some sort of a settlement, and so I'm not sure the details. I don't think they were disclosed, but it looks like he was paid a few $1 million just to shut up and not bother them anymore. That's my understanding. Again, nobody really knows the details. Now, another big important thing that I need to say here about venture capitalists is that you don't have to be a big known company to solicit venture capital. Right? So here's, for example, a story of a very talented student who once took my course, Emil Dulguero. It was back in Canada, must have been 2007, 2006 or something like that. He was a student in his, I believe at that time, second or third year. Looked kind of, well, here on the picture that you see, he looks in a suit with a tie and everything, but showing up for classes, he would have jeans like with holes in them and long hair, so he looked more like a hippie. But anyway, he had a wonderful idea for some sort of a vehicle that allows, you know, commuting within the cities. He never disclosed what exactly that was, but my understanding is that it was something similar to Segway, like those two-wheeled, you know, commuter vehicles. And so he wanted to make them, and he needed capital, and so he couldn't raise that capital in Canada. He was too young. I don't know, it was not easy, but luckily for him, he spent several years in China as a child. His parents worked there, and so he was originally from Bulgaria, and then he spent a few years in China and became fluent in Mandarin, in Chinese language. And then eventually his family moved to Canada, where he spent most of his life. And so because he spoke Chinese and because he had some connections there, he went to some sort of a like venture capitalist conference in Hong Kong, I believe, and eventually was able to obtain $2 million in capital in 2007 from one of the Hong Kong venture capitalists. And so being still a student, being still a young man, he was able to secure enough funding to start a whole new big business. And so for a student with nothing but an idea, it was possible, so it may be possible for you as well. So I strongly encourage you to explore those options, and if you have an idea for a business and you need capital, there may be ways to get it, even if you've never done it before, even if you have nothing but only an idea. Now, here is another question, and the answer is back-to-back loan, C. Now, emerging stock markets. Sometimes we look, or in fact, most of the time, we look at emerging markets as markets where you cannot sell shares, nobody trusts nobody. So it would not be on our mind to start selling shares of a company in those markets. However, you shouldn't really look down upon them because it may be your option, especially if you're trying to do business there. So for example, here on the picture, you see a stock exchange in Bhutan, and that's what it is. So if you saw New York Stock Exchange, I mean, what you see here on the picture in Bhutan, it's like 1/1000th. So it's a very, very small, that's basically the market. But still operates, and they call it hot money because the prices of shares tend to, go up and down a lot. But again, it's still an option, and it actually may allow you to raise a lot of capital, especially if you're coming from a kind of stable, developed country. They may find you as an attractive option because you may look to them much more attractive to their investors, to their share buyers, as their local companies, and you actually may be able to sell a good portion of your company for good money in those stock exchanges. So again, consider that as an option, and when the time comes, don't dismiss it just because it looks not so professional or not so developed as it is in your country. Here is a question for you, and the answer clearly is venture capital. Talking about venture capitalists, by the way, one of the good things when you go with venture capitalists is that not only will they give you the money, in most cases they literally become your partners in business. It's not just they give the money and wait until you make or break it. They would in many cases appoint a senior manager with experience who would be helping you. In many cases they would also share managerial and economic expertise with you. For example, when Facebook that we just mentioned was raising capital on their large scale for the first time before they went IPO, when they were going through venture capitalists, when they got the money, there was one venture capitalist, I can't remember who that was, but they literally appointed an older person, I believe it was actually a woman, who was working with those kids, and at that time they were still kids, and literally was kind of overseeing what they're doing. It's not because the venture capitalists didn't trust them, it's just because they felt that with some adult supervision, the company will be able to grow faster, to grow better, and make more profits for the venture capitalists. But it's also good for you because, as I said, venture capitalists are as interested in your profits as you are because, they invested, they gave their own money to you so that money can grow. So they are as interested in your profits and in your future as you are. Anyway, this is what you need to know on the exam. Thank you very much.